I got talking to the one guy and he asked me what I did for a living. I told him I was a reporter for the Frontiersman. He goes, you know what we need again? We need stories about Alaska, the vastness of the state and the nature. We need more of that. None of this politics writing. And I said, okay. But I thought about that for years and years about how there is so much amazing nature in this state that there's important things going on. But I want to write about just the beauty of where we live and different aspects of it.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Michael Rovito, the Deputy Director of the Alaska Power Association. The Alaska Power Association is the statewide trade association that represents the electric utilities that supply power to more than 500,000 Alaskans across our huge state. As part of his duties with APA, Michael hosts his own podcast called Alaska Powerline, which talks about issues facing Alaska's electric utilities. What we learned from today's interview is that Mike trained as a journalist and moved to Alaska in 2006 to take a job at the Frontiersman newspaper in the Mat-Su Valley. He left journalism to staff Senator Linda Menard, who represented Wasilla in the Alaska State Senate from 2009 until she was defeated by Mike Dunleavy in the Republican primary of 2012. Mike Rovito has never stopped writing, and as you heard in the intro, he has a Substack called Alaska Rhythms, which largely focuses on his nature writing. Michael Rovito, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate being here.
Where were you born?
I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. And actually, I lived in a suburb of Cincinnati called Blue Ash, is where I grew up. It was a great childhood. My mom and dad, they were both Cincinnati, born and raised. And I got a brother named Dan. He's 3 years younger than me. I was into the outdoors big time, although there was less outdoor opportunity there than there is here in Alaska. We live right next to a park called Sharon Woods that had a golf course and then a lake and then some woods and a gorge. And I spent a lot of time down there. I was a kid, I played baseball, and then I got real into volleyball when I got into high school. Volleyball was a big deal for me, and I played in high school. I didn't go on to play in college after high school. I was done with that. I think it ruined my knees eventually too. But I was always destined for Alaska because even though I had never been here before I moved here, I found it very attractive, a very cool way of life, and this is where I always wanted to be.
Where'd you go to college?
Went to the University of Cincinnati.
Oh, so you stayed in the Cincinnati area pretty much straight through?
I did. I had a little 1 year kind of deviation. So when I graduated from high school, I really wanted to work outdoors. And so my mom actually found a college in Eastern Ohio called Hocking College, which was a tiny college. And I took wildlife management there. And the idea was to go on to some sort of a career, whether it's in the national parks or something like that. However, I think at the age of 18, being away from home, my time management was not the best on earth. And I didn't perform very well at that college. And I decided to move back home. And then, I went to University of Cincinnati, started as an English major. And then I moved into communications and eventually double majored with communications and journalism.
Did you work as a journalist?
I did. My first job in Alaska actually was at the Mat-Su Valley Frontiersman newspaper.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah. So I started as a journalist, and it was actually interesting because I started in 2006 as a journalist there.
Let me just pause for a second. Did you take that job as the reason to move to Alaska?
It was my ticket here, basically. So my wife, her name is Candace, and she's from Dayton, Ohio, north of Cincinnati. And I got lucky to meet the only girl in Ohio who wanted to move to Alaska, right? And we met in college, and we both wanted to move up here, but we didn't want to move without a job.
How did you know about Alaska? What brought that into your consciousness?
I think a lot of National Geographic, honestly. I watched a lot of programs about Alaska. I read books about Alaska when I was a kid. I really had this attraction to Arctic life, the cold and the mountains and the snow and dark and all that sort of stuff. And where I grew up in Cincinnati, I remember in the 80s and 90s, I was born in 1982. Remember in the 80s and 90s that we got snow, but then for some reason we fell out of the snow belt. And it was really devastating to me not to have snow. I just really loved it. And I would watch all these different programs about Alaska and life in the bush and things like that. And it just was very attractive to me as a place to live. And then I met Candace in college, and she also wanted to move to Alaska. She actually has...
Was that a first date question? I was like, how do you feel about Alaska?
Actually, it was pretty early off. When we first met, we talked about trees and our shared love of trees. So that was a good meet cute, I guess they say nowadays in the young kid parlance. But yeah, she has family here in Tok and in Fairbanks. And they are all from Ohio originally. And then her uncles moved to Tok for various reasons. And when we met in 2004, a couple months after we met, her and her mother and brothers took a trip up here to Alaska to do like an RV trip. And she came back and she was like, yeah, that's the place to live. It's beautiful up there. And I think it just hardened our resolve to go to Alaska. But having graduated from college, and she has a degree in environmental science and geology, we didn't want to come up here without jobs, I think. And so I was aware back in the old days, there was a website called journalismjobs.com, and newspapers would post their jobs on this website. You could just go browse through them by state. And I saw some jobs in Alaska. I actually applied first at the Anchorage Daily News, and they sent me back a nice postcard that said, basically, you don't have enough experience to work here. Get some experience and then try again. And so I said, okay. So I started calling different community newspapers, and I ended up calling the Frontiersman, and the editor at the time answered the phone. I never thought I'd get the editor.
Who was that?
His name was Mark Kelsey. He was the editor at the time, and I got him, and I actually called him from the student newspaper office at the University of Cincinnati, where I was the managing editor, and I said, here's what I want to do. He said, you're in luck. We're looking for another reporter. He said, don't send me a resume because you haven't done anything. Send me clips of your writing. And I had worked at internships at various local newspapers and magazines. And I sent him a bunch of clips. And the short version of this story is this was June of 2006. And then I think it was early July, he called me up and he basically said, I can't pay your way up here, but if you can get up here in August, you're hired. You got the job. So
It was like a full-time job.
Full-time job, full-time reporter. And so I called Candace, who was working at a restaurant called Steak and Shake back east. And I said, hey, guess what? And she said, all right, we're going. And we made plans, and we got loaded up my truck and put her car behind my truck on a little car carrier and drove 9 days from Ohio to Alaska.
And did you move to the Matsu?
We moved right to the Matsu.
That's before the governor election. There's a candidate from the Matsu who's going to become governor. I assume they probably didn't give that beat to the brand new reporter from Ohio, but it seems like an exciting time to be a reporter in the Matsu.
It was, and it didn't get that beat right away. So that was 2006. And then Candace got a job at a company down in Colorado. So we left Alaska very briefly in January of 2007, went to this job in Colorado. I worked at a newspaper down there. Her job sent her to Safford, Arizona, where they were opening a new mine. And I also got a job at the mine, just kind of doing quality assurance work. We did that for a few months, and we said, we don't want to do this. We want to go back to Alaska. So the Frontiersman graciously took me back. And that's when it was really exciting, because at that point, soon thereafter, was when John McCain had chosen Sarah Palin as his running mate. And so I was eventually sent down to Pennsylvania to ride the Straight Talk Express bus with her and be an embedded reporter for about 3 days on the trail with Sarah Palin to report on her life on the trail and what she was seeing. And I was a guppy amongst national news. I mean,
I bet you met a lot of famous reporters.
Yeah, I sat by Savannah Guthrie and talked to her about Alaska and just people who became, very famous. And I was just this little guy from Alaska with my notepad, and that was it.
Do you have any stories from your time on the Straight Talk bus?
The most interesting thing to me was the first day you get there in the Secret Service process, where they check you out, they sniff you with the dog, then they give you this little badge after they've checked you out. And there were some Secret Service agents assigned to the press bus, and they were like our protection, which was interesting. And you get to know some of these Secret Service agents, and it was fascinating, their lives. I mean, they worked, at that time at least, it was almost like slope work. They worked shifts, right? So they were on like all the time for their however many weeks they were on a shift. And they made really good livings. But the fascinating thing to me was the process of it all, how they had this security detail. Like one night we were actually down there in Pennsylvania on Halloween. And I think it was Piper, Sarah Palin's daughter, went trick-or-treating in this one town called Dolphin, Pennsylvania. And what was interesting to me is we're walking down the sidewalk covering this. The Secret Service is following with this big SUV. And every time we stopped, they would open the back door and wait just in case they had to rush her into the thing there. But it was an interesting time, especially to be press, because some of the events we showed up at, we were not loved as the press back in the press bin. And so people were...
I bet it's worse now.
Yeah, I'm not in it now. So I'm thankful for that. But I think it was just, the experience was fascinating. I mean, we got to see it from behind the scenes and on the Straight Talk Express. I think the interesting thing to me was the pre-event. They would prepare her. So you had all the speechwriters who would just have this huddle and say,
And you got to watch that.
I got to watch it. I sat next to Greta Van Susteren, who was working, I think, for Fox News at the time. And we just rode this bus as they quickly prepped for, here's where we're going, here's what we're doing.
That's interesting. What was her prep like? Were they telling her exactly what she was going to say, or giving her facts for her to riff off of, or how did that work?
I think from what I saw, it was more of here's like the talking points, like here's where we're going, here's the town, or here's, like the local flavor. She really went out there and did the speech, right? I think they could prepare her however they wanted to, but she was going to go out and do her own version of the speech. But it's the one and only inside look I ever had at a presidential or vice presidential campaign. So I have nothing to compare it to, but just the number of people that worked on that campaign and all their different rules that they had, it was really a fascinating thing to me. It made me actually really appreciate going back to Palmer, Alaska, where it's like chill and there's not all that kind of like tension all the time.
That time on the bus, was that at a time when she was in good graces with the McCain campaign? Because I know that later on she fell out and there was some tension between McCain's side of the street and the Palin side of the street.
I didn't see any of that. Actually, when I was down there, it seemed like the press and Sarah Palin and her family had a great relationship. And it was Halloween weekend. And so some of the press dressed up as members of the Palin family and they all got pictures together and got a kick out of it. So I personally didn't see any of that sort of stuff when I was down there.
So you came back to Palmer, and I know you eventually worked in this building. So how did you transition from being a reporter in the Matsu to being staff in the building?
Yeah. So when I was a reporter in the Matsu, the borough mayor was a guy named Kurt Menard. And I got to know him real well. And then as he was the mayor, and he unfortunately passed away in 2009, but just a real great guy. And his wife at the time, Linda Menard, was running for the state Senate. And she won the election. And I think Kurt suggested me to her because he had made a comment that journalists made good staffers. As a legislative staff, there's a lot of research and writing and communications and things along those lines. And I was not making what I would call a great living at the newspaper at that time. And
do you mind us telling us how much you made?
Let's just say it was less than $15 an hour as a journalist, which was frustrating to me because it was a dream job for me. I wanted to be a journalist. I went to school to be a journalist. I was living in Alaska, but just that pay was not easy to live on. Especially we had our first daughter on the way when I was offered the job to come work in the Senate. And I had always had an interest in politics, just as an observer. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity, one, to make a better living, but two, to also be a part of the process, because every single day down here in the Capitol where we're sitting is a history-making day. Even if it's a mundane day, history is being made. And so I talked it over with Candace because I'd have to go away for
4 months.
4 months. Although at that time, my first 2 years, so I was the 09 session and the 010 session, the 10 session. If I remember correctly, we stuck to 90 days then. So I was back by mid-April. And then the 11 and 12 session, they started fudging the 90-day deadline. And yeah, it's 121 days. Yeah. Anyway, backing up. Yeah. So I said, I talked to Candace and she said, yeah, let's do it. I'm fine. I'll be here at the house. And
what was she working?
She was, at the time, she worked for a company called Dow, doing geotechnical work. And yeah, she was pregnant with our first daughter, Joplin, at that time. And so I came down here and she stayed.
Did you name her after Janis Joplin?
Candace named her, and yeah, a little after Janis Joplin. Candace liked to look for really unique names. So it's Joplin. Our other daughter is Jolie, 2 J names. And so, we always joke that like my name, Michael, is a typical 1980s name. And we were looking for something a little more unique. And I think with Joplin especially, we succeeded because all her teachers have said, I've never met another Joplin in all the years that they've been teachers. It's a unique name for a really unique kid. And Jolie the same. I think I've maybe heard of one other Jolie, but yeah, that's 2 unique names.
So you did 4 years with Senator Menard.
I did.
Yeah. What was it like working for her?
Oh, it was great. She was a great boss. She was really good at making sure that her staff had what we needed and were taken care of. And an opportunity to learn too, because when she came in, she was the state affairs chair. And so I didn't staff that committee. I eventually became her chief of staff.
And you came to work with her when she was a freshman senator.
Senator.
So you got to see her learn the job while you were learning the job as well.
Yeah, exact same time. And I remember the first few weeks here was like deer in headlights, because luckily there's a lot of great people in this building that have been here for a very long time that were helpful. But, there's a lot of procedures and processes down here that are very just process oriented that you got to learn or else you feel freaked out. And actually, one of the first people to come say hello to us was now Senator Jesse Keel. He was a staffer back then. And I remember Senator Keel coming down and just being so welcoming and saying, if you guys need any help, come talk to me. I've been around the building. And yeah, it was a big learning curve. I remember the first time I was in front of a committee, I was just freaked out, just remembering all the processes. But you learn it pretty quick, I think, and it's a good place to work.
Do you have a story from your 4 years? Or were you here for just 4 years?
I was here for 4 years. So she had a 4-year term. And then she was out of the Senate after that.
Because she didn't run for re-election, but she was defeated.
She did run for re-election. She was defeated in the primary by now Governor Mike Dunleavy when he became a senator. And so
he primaried her from the right?
He primaried her, yeah. At the time, there was a 10-10 split, 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats in the Senate. And Senator Menard had joined the bipartisan working group, which I think was not looked upon with great favor in the Maysu Valley. And she did not win the primary. At that point in my life, though, we had just had our second daughter, Jolie. And so I was looking to get out of it anyhow, because I was coming down here and it was different then. I did try to go home a few times, but as a staffer, it's hard sometimes. You're not going home every weekend,
right,
usually. And as Juneau goes, sometimes I would have a ticket to fly out on a Friday and there'd be a storm here and the flights would be canceled. And so they put me on a flight on a Saturday and then I'd be home for 22 hours and get back on a plane and come back down.
So I asked about your wife working because with little babies, it seemed like she could come here, but that just wasn't an option.
Yeah, we didn't do it. I mean, it's because it would almost be like having two mortgages, basically. We owned a house in Palmer, and I was fortunate to rent a room from a gentleman down here that really turned into like kind of renting the whole house. So I had some fortunate renter luck, but yeah, just to bring the whole family down, it would have been very expensive. Yeah.
Do you have a particularly memorable story from your
time in the building? I don't know. There's a lot of memorable stuff that went on down here. I remember, and hopefully this doesn't get me in trouble. I remember I like being in the Senate because they seemed to get done earlier. It seemed like the House would just
that's still true.
Okay, yeah. The House would just go and go.
Like, I mean, yeah, so many times that the House is doing stuff at 7 p.m. and like the Senate would never, like, just not go past 5.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember many times I come back in the morning at 8 o'clock, and some of my friends who were staff in the House were like, "We didn't get out here till 1 o'clock in the morning last night," especially at the end of session.
Right. I think the speaker at the time, Chanel, was notorious. That was a strategy that he used to keep people super late, because when it's super, super late,
right,
people will just vote to get this over with so we can get out of here. How do you want me to vote? Let's get off this floor.
Yeah.
And so it's a way of forcing a certain vote.
Interesting. Yeah. I was cozy in bed at 10 o'clock.
Yeah.
And everyone else was still here in the building. But if there's one thing that I remember from those times that's a lot different from this times, it was the capital budget. There was robust capital budget.
Well, because ACES had passed, and I just had Sarah Palin's Commissioner of Revenue, Pat Galvin, on. Yeah. And the CDR, the state savings account, went from $4 billion to $18 billion,
right,
in the course of his tenure.
Yeah.
So there was just a lot more money.
Yeah, and I remember one year, I don't know if it was 2009. I think it might have been. I think wasn't oil at 118 or 120?
Yeah, it was really awesome, and we had just changed the tax system so that if oil price was really high, we were getting an enormous percentage of tax.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I remember that was nice as a staffer, especially because when you had the capital budget process, you had constituents from your district that had these great projects. And we were able to say yes to a lot of that, get it into the budget and fund a lot of things. I still think sometimes when I drive around the valley, you think of the things that got
Do you see anything?
funded.
Like, what's something that you see? That
I remember the Palmer Senior Center. I remember got the tail end of the dollars that they needed to build the new Palmer Senior Center. And so that was really nice. Some road projects around the valley, things along those lines. And yeah, it was an interesting time to have that budgetary kind of heft that I think we're missing nowadays. The capital budgets are so thin compared to what they used to be. But overall, just the camaraderie in this building was what was my favorite thing, especially if it was a late night. The staff, regardless of who they worked for at that time, was just chummy, right? We all got along. We all got through it together. It's almost like when I was down here some years ago with one of the CEOs of one of our member utilities from APA, and he said, "Man, everyone sees you. They say, hey, brother, like you've been through a war together or something." And I said, yeah, you get this, like, you're all in this building for 4 months working towards something. And even if you're on the other side of the issue, you get this camaraderie just from the experience. I really enjoyed that part of it.
So what happened after you left?
When the senator did not win her election, that was August of 2012. And so she was, of course, in office until January of 2013. And so I had to go out and look for a job. And one of the bills that Senator Menard carried would have been advantageous to the Knickarn Crossing project. And I'd gotten to know the people who worked at the Knickarn Bridge and Toll Authority at that time. And so there was a position open at Cabada. And so I went to work at Cabada in 2012, in the fall of 2012. And I worked there until about August of 2014. And so I was there right at the tail end of the Knickarn Bridge and Toll Authority experience.
Interesting. Where'd you go after that?
After that, I went to Alaska Power Association, and
that's where you've been.
That's where I've been for more than 10 years now. Yeah.
How did you find out about that job? What were the qualifications? Like, how did you get your in at Alaska Power?
Actually, so when the legislature moved the Knickarn Crossing project out of Cabada's purview and into the DOT, we were essentially defunded. And I had to go look for a job again. And a friend of mine actually saw the APA job posting. It was at the time, it was for the director of member of public relations position. And so he said to me, I think you'd be good for this. You should go for it. And so I read the job description and I said, yeah, I think I would be good for this. And I had an interview with my now boss, Crystal Ankvist, who had worked in the member of public relations position for 14 years before she was hired into the executive director role. And so I went and had a great interview with Crystal, the outgoing executive director, Marilyn Leland, and the chief financial officer, Brenda Mead. And we clicked, I think, real well. And I got a call, I can't remember how many days later it was, but I got a call offering me the job and I accepted it. And it was in my wheelhouse because there was a lot of member relations work. So we were the statewide trade association for electric utilities. And there was a lot of communications aspect to it. But then there was that government relations piece of it too. And I think that made me a pretty strong candidate, my knowledge of the process and people down here.
And I assume you liked the job.
I love the job.
Was it your idea to start the podcast?
It was a combination of things. We work with a company called Pioneer Utility Resources, which is down in the lower 48, and they support electric co-ops with a variety of different things. And so we were looking for a way to work with them to get more of a word out amongst the general public and legislators too about what Alaska's electric utilities do. And just through those conversations, it was suggested to us, what about a podcast? And I'm a podcast listener, including the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm a fan because I drive when I'm not in Juneau, I drive from Palmer to Anchorage to work. So that's an hour drive each way. And that's a great time for podcasts. And I thought, sure, let's give it a shot. Right. And
what's your podcast called?
It's called the Alaska Power Line.
And you started
about 2 years ago. I think it was about 2 years ago now. My good friend, Travis Millian, who's now the CEO of Golden Valley Electric Association. At the time, he was the Copper Valley Electric Association. And he was my first interview because I said, I want to go interview a friend first, get this going. At the time, I think they were pursuing or looking into at Copper Valley a potential micro-nuclear project for their co-op. It didn't end up working out, but it was my first dip of the toe into it.
It might have been last year or maybe the year before. It's sort of all blur, but I did go up to Fairbanks because they were going to do the micro reactor at Eielson. But I think that the details of that was that it was like a pilot project. It was going to take 10 years to really happen. And so it wasn't like we were going to get really good results from that pilot project till the mid 2030s. And so I went from being somebody who was like, oh, these micro reactors are going to save Alaska to being like, we're never going to get micro reactors. I don't know. Can you do a little update on where we are with those?
Yeah, and I think that's the hope with the micro nuclear reactors or small modular reactors, as people call them, is that they'll get to that scale where they work in Alaska. I think right now it's two things. It's one, it's the cost of that newer technology, right? It's just a lot of the electric utilities in Alaska, I think, simply can't afford to invest in that right now. But two, I think you're right with the proving it out. I don't think there's many utilities in Alaska who want to be serial number one project. And I think they want to see how this is going to work and prove out before they become really invested in this. But from a concept, if you scale these things to the size of the community that you have, to me, it's an absolute game changer. because it's not your grandfather's nuclear, right? We're not talking 3 Mile Island size things, Chernobyl, right? None of that. And I went to a lot of presentations when Copper Valley Electric was considering this. And you just look at how self-contained these new reactors are. I'm no scientific expert on them by any stretch of the imagination, but just their ability to put out not only the electricity, but then the heat too. I don't know how long it's going to be until they become viable for Alaska, but it's definitely something that electric utilities are keeping a close eye on and hoping that day comes sooner than later.
Speaking of other alternative forms of energy, I learned that you had solar panels on your house from listening to your interview with Homer Electric this morning. That's how I prepped for this podcast.
Yes.
I listened to that interview. And what was interesting is that you were talking about how by having these solar panels on your house that you really don't pay for electricity during the summer months. What's her name?
I think it was Sarah Lamb.
Sarah Lamb.
Yeah.
So she pushed back on that because she was like, technically from our perspective, it's a minute by minute issue. If it's overcast, your panels may not be producing enough power to power your home. So it's very complicated. It may look like you didn't use any power during the summer months, but you probably did. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about the decision to put solar panels on your house and what that experience has been like, because I know lots of folks have done it, but my family hasn't.
Yeah. In our decision, it wasn't so much monetary necessarily. It was more like lowering our carbon footprint. Got our own personal carbon footprint. I know there's arguments people can make left and right. I do drive a F-150, right? So you got solar panels on your house, but you're driving the gas guzzling truck. But for us, it was just almost like a sustainability long-term type of thing. And it is true. And I got to be careful how simplified I make it, because Sarah was right. It is different. Because definitely over the summer when I'm generating more from my solar panels than I'm using, I'm selling back to the grid. But I'm not getting rich off of it, obviously, and I'm putting back into the grid. But then at the same time, the grid is there as my battery backup when I need it too, right? And I think for us, it was more of, first of all, maybe a little bit of FOMO, because we saw some of our other neighbors putting them on their roofs. And then the FOMO comes from this, like I said, I wasn't going to simplify, but them saying, man, I don't have a bill this month. I haven't paid. And we're like, man, we want to get in on that too. So I think there's a little bit of that, but then a little bit of, it makes us feel good that we have panels and we're doing our part a little bit to harness the sun instead of using electricity just purely from the grid at all times.
So when you got here this morning, we were talking a little bit about the, I guess, technicalities of doing a podcast. So I assume that you don't edit your own podcast and that you have help from this other company.
I do. Yeah, I do have help. So I can do some light editing. I use a platform called Riverside.fm is my podcasting recording platform. And in that, I figured out how to do some editing just to chop out the ums or like a cough. Or if somebody calls me up afterwards and said, man, I misspoke horribly, you got to take that part out or something. I'll do that for folks. But adding in the music and kind of the cool intros, I do have someone else do that for me.
I had no desire to learn how to edit a podcast. I had to.
How do you do it? What do you use?
I have a platform called Descript. Obviously, you can see I do not use high-tech equipment. I've used this recorder since the day I started my podcast. I use AI to optimize my audio. So rather than have expensive equipment, I just ask my AI to make it sound like I used expensive equipment.
Okay.
And it works 75% of the time. Sometimes I have shitty sound. Yeah. That's just the fact of the matter. Sometimes it does not work. But
it sounds good. I'm listening to it in my truck when I listen.
Yeah. My husband's theory was that post-COVID, people had more tolerance for different types of audio. Yeah. Everybody's been on a Zoom. Sorry. Everyone's gotten used to listening to really bad audio.
Yeah. I ended up buying a Shure microphone because I remember that first podcast I did with Travis. When I heard it, it sounded very tinny. Because at that time, I just recorded it on Microsoft Teams, and then I sent it off to Pioneer to do the editing, and I thought, this isn't...
Well, what I've also learned is that the thing that sucks about recording through Zoom, which I have to do a lot, or Teams or whatever, is that then I'm reliant on their microphone, their room, wherever they're recording it. I interviewed Sharon Gleason, the federal judge for the state of Alaska. A really great interview. I love the content, but there was a buzzing noise that I could hear from the moment we started recording. I didn't know what to do because she had such a tight schedule.
Right.
I couldn't say, let's reschedule, let's do this at a different time. I was like, I got to get this. And it's so painful for me to listen to it because I want that audio to be better, but it was out of my control.
Yeah, that's the thing. Sometimes I really like doing interviews in person because I'll take my microphone gear with me. Like I interviewed a guy named George Hornberger who runs INN Electric Cooperative out in Iliamna when I was out there. And I find that a lot better because like we're doing face to face. We got like the body cues,
Right.
we're kind of playing off each other. Even if I'm seeing somebody online, it's like there's that weird lag or you go talk over each other or something.
So when I was thinking about having you on the podcast, I was Googling you and I found your Substack. At the time, I read your most recent Substack, which is about everything that you'd read last year. And you and I conversed a little bit about books.
Yeah.
It makes total sense that you were an English major and a journalist, which I didn't know. But then I looked at your Substack this morning and read some of your other entries. They are not book reviews. Most of your stuff is like nature writing. It's almost like short stories.
Yeah.
Like somebody's a writer who's about to put together a book.
Right. Yeah. I have this like pseudo dream, I guess, to be a writer. And I've always wanted, I have 3 different novels started that have gotten like 50 pages in and then I've abandoned them. And I read about all these famous writers and their struggles to write. And I'm like, no, I need to have a day job. And so I'm definitely not quitting my day job to become a writer or going the Cormac McCarthy route where you just are poor until you publish something that grabs things. But the Substack began because one of the other
What's it called?
It's called Alaska Rhythms. One of the other things I do for my job is there's a magazine called Ruralite, and Ruralite is actually published also by Pioneer Utility Resources. And it's a magazine that electric cooperatives, if they're a member of the magazine, they distribute to their co-op members. And it's been around since, I don't know, maybe like 30s or 40s, I think. It's been around for a long time. And it has stories about rural life, and it's got recipes and this cool little section where like you can write in for requests for different things. Like people are like, I need 50 buttons from every state. Can you send them this address? Like an old time magazine like you see in rural America. And as part of this job, I write a monthly column, so to speak, in that magazine. And then the electric co-ops in Alaska who distribute that can decide whether or not they use the column. And it's billed as Alaska News. And so it was supposed to be, when I came on board, it was mostly like about Alaska electric utility stuff. But over the years, I decided I'm just going to take this in a different way and write about interesting Alaska things. Because I remember there was this moment when I worked for the Frontiersmen a long time ago. And this was like a very weird story where we were going to build a fence around our yard at our house. And so I had a bunch of fence companies come over and give me estimates. And I got talking to the one guy, and he asked me what I did for a living. I told him I was a reporter from the Frontiersmen. He goes, you know what we need again? We need stories about Alaska, the vastness of the state and the nature. We need more of that. None of this politics writing. And, you know, it's a funny guy. And I said, okay. But I thought about that for years and years about how there is so much amazing nature in this state that there's important things going on. But I want to write about just the beauty of where we live and different aspects of it. And so I started taking those Ruralite articles that I had written and then adding them to that Substack. And then I started writing some more long form or for some more original content on there too. So yeah, most of it is my nature writing. And then this last fall, my youngest daughter challenged me to read as many books as I could. And so I read as many books as I could between October and the end of the year. And then I decided I'm going to write about them because that seems to get a lot of traction out there.
You read a very wide range of books. The one that I focused in on was Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, which is a tremendous book. It won absolutely every award the year that it came out. Such an amazing book. But then he did the impossible, that he followed up with a completely different book that also won every single award of the year. Yeah. Like just incredible. Like, how did you do those 2 in a row?
Oh yeah.
And Nickel Boys, which you haven't read yet, but you have to read. I swear there's no book that has hit. I mean, and I think there's a movie version that just came out.
Yeah, I heard about
that.
But
yeah, so good.
Yeah, it's on my list because the Underground Railroad, I had heard about that. I listened to the New York Times book review podcast.
But so did I. Was addicted when what was her name? Paul. They used to have the woman who hosted it.
Okay.
Oh, you've got to go back and listen.
Go back in time.
It used to be so good.
Okay.
Now Gilbert Cruz has taken over.
Yeah.
I think it sucks.
Really?
I'm not going to cut this out. Okay. Gilbert Cruz sucks. What is her name? Paul.
Her name was Pamela Paul.
She did it for like 10 years.
Really?
They fired her because she wrote some anti-trans op-ed in the New York Times, and they canceled her.
Oh.
And she was a really great host.
Wow.
In spite of her op-ed. Whatever. But anyway, back to you.
Yeah. No.
So listening to New York Times Book Review podcast.
Yeah, and I heard about, I actually interviewed Colson Whitehead on there about his writing style and how he comes to it. Because that's what's always fascinating to me as someone who fancies himself a writer is how do these folks get to the point where they write these novels, right? I read a lot of Larry McMurtry, who wrote Lonesome Dove is what most people would know him for. And I read a novel like that, and I think this is amazing that I've been sucked into this story. How does somebody sit there over the course of months or years or however and come up with this out of their head? Because I feel like I can write a short story just fine. But then when it gets to like novel length,
You have to keep it all inside your
or how
brain.
do you remember it? I wrote a very short Western in the style of Louis L'Amour that I've only shared with my parents and my family. And I've never published it because it's not ready for prime time. And that is I've probably wrote like 22 pages. And even that, I remember like getting near the end, I was like, what did I say 14 pages ago? And am I tying this incorrectly? And I'm just like, it just boggles my mind. So that's why I was fascinated to hear of Colson Whitehead. But you're right. The work I have read, The Underground Railroad, that book is not an uplifting book, I will say. It's an important book. I think people should read it. But it was interesting to me because the subject matter is a downer, but I couldn't put it down, the book. And a lot of times people might think you're reading this very depressing book, but it was just the way it was written kept you going and going.
Hey, what's a book that you recommend besides The Underground Railroad?
So I've read now 3 of the Dune books. And I have to say, I put off reading those for years and years because I wasn't really huge into science fiction. But then I was at Tidal Wave, where I've run into you before at Tidal Wave Books. And I saw it there and I figured, what the heck, I'll give it a shot. And I'll tell you, the Frank Herbert who wrote that book, that is an amazing book. And there's not a lot of science fiction-y stuff in it, right? It's not robots and all that. Clearly it's set in a science fiction universe, but it's a lot about relationships and power and monarchy and politics. And it's real fascinating. The Dune series is a great book. What other books have really... A Lonesome Dove, I can't recommend enough to people. Even if you don't read Westerns, that is a book that is much more than Westerns. That's about everything from aging to the changing of the country and society to family relationships to loyalty, action and adventure. Lonesome Dove, I think it's more than 900 pages. But I read that book very fast, and that's a high-quality book, is Lonesome Dove.
Mike Rovito, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
I appreciate it.
Find links to the Alaska Powerline podcast in the show notes, as well as a link to Mike's Substack, Alaska Rhythms. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-465-4940.